Let's expose the flaw hiding right in the center of UBI, the one nobody promoting it ever wants to talk about. UBI is built for stability, not mobility, and stability without mobility isn't a safety net. It's a slow-motion trap. Because here's the truth. UBI doesn't just fail to solve the problem, it quietly creates more of it. And the first place that shows up is inflation. Think about the chain reaction. When millions of people receive extra money at the same time, demand rises instantly. But supply? Supply doesn't magically grow just because deposits hit accounts. So prices climb, rent climbs, groceries climb, services climb. Everything rises to meet the new floor of consumer spending. And now you've got an economy where the cost of living has inflated upward to swallow the very payments that were supposed to help people breathe. The solution becomes the spark. The fire gets hotter, and you're told the answer is even more UBI funded by the ever-growing deficit. That's the loop nobody warns you about. UBI pressures prices upward, and the inflation that follows makes more people dependent on UBI. You don't escape the system, you sink deeper into it. And here's where the trap tightens. When income is guaranteed, leaders no longer feel urgency to fix anything upstream. Why address housing shortages if rising rent can be covered with a higher UBI? Why repair education, reform healthcare, or confront wage stagnation? Failure not only becomes funded, it becomes compounded by inflation and debt-funded UBI. Dysfunction appears to become affordable. The result, a system that doesn't improve, just inflates. And inside that inflation spiral, something crucial happens to the human mind. This false security becomes sedation. You stop pushing, you stop demanding, you stop climbing. Not because you're lazy, but because pressure shapes behavior, and UBI removes pressure in all the wrong places. Prices rise, mobility stalls, leadership relaxes, and you, once a participant, slide into dependence and worse, control by the state. But ownership flips that entire equation. Ownership creates leverage because it gives you a piece of the value that inflation protects, not destroys. When inflation rises, assets rise, equity rises, the future income tied to those assets rises. Ownership converts inflation from a predator into fuel. Income decays, ownership compounds. And that's the pivot point. UBI locks people into a system where rising prices swallow their stability. OBP puts people into a system where rising value becomes their advantage. Mobility needs compounding. Coming up, we're going to break down exactly why ownership compounds while income, any income, slowly evaporates. Income dies when you clock out. Ownership keeps paying after you sleep. That's the line nobody says out loud because it exposes the entire flaw in how we've been trained to think about money. We've been conditioned to believe income is the goal. Get paid, spend, repeat. But income is linear. It moves in a straight line. You trade an hour, you get $1. Stop trading, the line stops moving. Ownership is exponential. It compounds, it multiplies while you're not looking. It grows while you're on vacation, while you're sick, while you're asleep. Because ownership isn't tied to your time, it's tied to the value of something bigger than you, the machine you help build. Here's the physics of money. Labor creates value once. Capital captures value forever. That's why the wealth gap accelerates every single year. It's not because rich people work harder, it's because they own the engine, they own the upside, they own the compounding. And here's the brutal truth. As long as only capital compounds, inequality will keep widening. You can raise wages, you can raise UBI, you can raise minimums until the ink runs dry. It doesn't matter. Linear income will never outrun exponential growth. Ever. Period. So what does OBP do? It injects capital exposure into the people creating the value. It takes the upside that's been locked behind boardroom doors and spreads it across the workforce. Suddenly, you're not just trading hours, you're holding equity. You're collecting dividends. You're participating in the compounding that used to belong to someone else. Think about the shift. You go from how many hours can I sell to how much value can I help create? You stop being a renter in the economy and start being a shareholder in the system you power every day. And here's the kicker: when you own, inflation flips from enemy to ally. Rising prices crush income because income is fixed, but rising prices often lift asset values. Ownership turns inflation into fuel. Income gets eaten alive, ownership eats back. This is mobility. This is leverage. This is the escape hatch from the treadmill we exposed. Because mobility doesn't come from more hours or bigger checks, it comes from compounding. And compounding only lives in ownership. I showed you earlier how UBI locks people into dependence and even drives inflation that eats its own promise. I just showed you why ownership breaks that cycle and builds a future that scales. But now ask yourself, if ownership is the engine, who controls the keys? That's coming next, and it's going to hit harder than anything you've heard so far. Stay locked in. The war for your future is just warming up. That's the question that decides whether you live free or live managed. Here's the truth nobody selling UBI wants to admit. UBI centralizes influence. OBP decentralizes it. And that difference isn't academic. It's the line between autonomy and control. Start with predictability. Governments love predictable systems because predictable systems are easy to adjust, suspend, or weaponize. UBI is perfect for that. It's a single lever. Push it forward, pull it back, freeze it when budgets tighten, or tie it to compliance when politics demand obedience. That's not conspiracy, that's mechanics. When your survival depends on a monthly deposit, the hand that funds you owns you, and the power to shape you. Now flip the lens. Ownership breaks that lever. When citizens hold equity, profit shares, or stock options, they don't wait for permission, they participate in the system itself. They pressure leaders instead of being pressured by leaders. They vote with their voice and their stake. They become hard to intimidate because they don't rely on anyone to live. And that's what you need to hear. You can't intimidate people who don't rely on you to survive. That's psychological sovereignty. Owners think long-term because their upside is long-term. They vote for stability because their wealth depends on stability. They demand competence because incompetence costs them personally. Dependence, they think short-term because their lifeline is short-term. They vote for the next deposit, not the next decade. Zoom out to systems behavior. A nation of millions of dependents is fragile. It bends under pressure because its citizens are tethered to a single source of security. Cut the cord and chaos follows. A nation easy to manipulate and divide, but a nation of millions of owners, that's resilience. That's distributed strength. That's a system where power isn't concentrated in one hand, it's spread across millions of hands holding real stakes and real value. That is a nation united. This is why OBP isn't just economics, it's structural freedom. It decentralizes influence by decentralizing wealth. It turns citizens from managed participants into active shareholders in the machine they power every day. What happens to that machine when workers share in ownership of the gears? What happens to productivity, innovation, and stability when the people turning the bolts also hold the blueprint? That is next up, and it's going to show you why OBP doesn't just liberate people, it strengthens everything it touches. Stay locked in. The war for your future is accelerating. Mobility, compounding, power. We've covered all three. Now let's scale it. Because this isn't just about your paycheck, it's about the machine that runs the entire economy. Here's the sharp contrast. UBI circulates money, OBP creates money, and that difference decides whether a system grows stronger or slowly eats itself alive. UBI is consumption fuel. It's designed to keep the wheels turning by handing out cash that gets spent immediately. That sounds good, until you realize spending without production is a sugar rush. It spikes demand, inflates prices, and then burns out. Nothing new gets built. Nothing new gets owned. The system doesn't grow, it just spins faster until the bearings fail. OBP is production fuel. It doesn't just move money around, it multiplies it by tying workers to the value they help create. When employees own part of the machine gets stronger. When productivity climbs, waste falls, innovation accelerates. Why? Because incentives align. When your upside depends on quality, you care about quality. When your future depends on efficiency, you fight for efficiency, and the data backs it up. Ownership-based firms, ESOPs, profit-sharing models, cooperatives consistently outperform traditional companies. They show higher productivity, lower turnover, greater resilience, and better crisis performance. When recessions hit, these firms bend but don't break. Why? Because owners don't abandon their own ship. They ride out the storm. Now zoom out to the national level. Imagine millions of firms operating on OBP principles. Supply chains stabilize because local owners reinvest locally. Bubbles shrink because wealth isn't concentrated in a handful of hands. It's distributed across millions of stakeholders. Communities strengthen because people aren't just employees, they're partners, and partners think long-term. This is the economic engine UBI can never build. UBI is a patch on a sinking hull. OBP is a redesign of the ship. It doesn't just keep you afloat, it makes the vessel faster, stronger, and capable of crossing oceans without capsizing. Mobility gave you freedom, compounding gave you growth, power gave you independence. Now scale all of that across an entire nation, and you get transformation. So what does that transformation look like? What does a country built on ownership, not dependence, actually become? That's coming up next, and it's the vision that changes everything. I am about to show you the end game. A nation of owners isn't a slogan, it's a system upgrade. When capital access widens, inequality shrinks without force. No mandates, no coercion, just participation that pays. That's the pivot. OBP scales from personal empowerment to national transformation. The middle class stops being a balancing act between two paychecks and a prayer. It gets rebuilt by participation, not dependence. When households own slices of the engines they fuel, shares, profit links, ESOP stakes, they don't just survive volatility, they harvest it. Upside spreads, downside cushions, families plan instead of panic. Long-term thinking replaces short-term desperation because incentives finally align. You protect what you own. That owner mindset changes everything. Responsibility replaces apathy. Engagement replaces cynicism. Kids grow up hearing words like compounding and value creation because those words matter when upside is real. Stability returns not as nostalgia, but as design. Then the flywheel spins. More owners, better firms, stronger communities, safer pensions, fewer crises. Each turn compounds the future. Each turn decentralizes power. Remember, stability versus mobility, OBP delivers both. Linear versus exponential, income is a line, ownership is a curve, and curves win. Control versus liberation, UBI centralizes a lever, OBP distributes the levers. Consumption versus production, UBI circulates, OBP creates. On every axis, ownership wins because it changes the mechanics, not just the mood. This is precisely why the elite pursue it. This isn't theory, it's a map you can walk today. Ask for ownership, negotiate for equity, choose companies that share upside, build your own portfolio, automate, dollar cost average, reinvest. Teach financial literacy to your circle. The republic isn't saved by one giant reform. It's saved by millions of small stakes that add up to a nation that refuses to be managed. Small stakes and small tasks, even something as small as a like and subscribe, helps spread the word, helps build ownership. You wanted the end game. Here it is, a country where citizens don't beg for relief, they build it. Where households aren't crushed by inflation, they ride assets through it. Where leadership can't intimidate the public, because the public does not rely on leadership to live. Owners aren't spectators, owners are the system, and that's the future worth fighting for. Forge the future. OBP is the way. Like and subscribe. The republic needs you.